There are so many of us committed to improving the lives of the youth in our communities. The In It for Youth podcast is a place for us to come together, from professionals who work with and serve youth to those that champion issues affecting children, to community advocates and stakeholders, and insightful young minds too. The In It for Youth podcast is a tapestry of voices united by a dedication to youth well-being and empowering the young generations of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Jamie Gale, and I'm so glad you've joined me on this team that is in it for youth. Welcome back to the show. It is so amazing to be able to talk with so many experts for this podcast. I am absolutely loving the conversations that I'm getting to have. It's such a great peek into different and important specialties with people that are working to serve youth. And I am so happy that I get to bring you these different perspectives. And my hope is always that each episode serves as a valuable resource. I know that today's conversation will benefit anyone who works with kids or has kids, especially older kids, so much. My guest today is Zach Meyer. Zach Meyer is a licensed professional therapist who has been working with teens and young adults for almost 20 years. He and his wife are in private practice together, owning Pneuma Psychology Services in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Zach believes working on our mental health has the power to change the course of the rest of our lives, and he believes the greatest gift parents can give to their children is to do their own work, interrupting generational traumas and passing that healing onto their children. Zach is also a musician, recording engineer, and producer. When he's not doing therapy or making music, Zach can most likely be found hanging out with his wife, 3 kids, and 2 rescue dogs, or slowly restoring his historic 1913 home. I've known Zach for almost 30 years, believe it or not. We went to high school together in the Milwaukee area, and over the last handful of years, he has shared such great resources for teens and parents online, and I've come to learn more about what his work involves. Especially over COVID, reading the advice and the thoughts that he shared really showcased how much valuable insight he has into how to best support teens and their mental health. And I am so happy that he is joining me for this important conversation today. Congratulations on all of your impact on youth well-being, Zach, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Me too. Okay, so let's start with your current work with youth. Can you fill us in on your work with teens and mental health so we can kind of get a picture of what that all entails?
Yeah. So I like to say I've worked with students since I was one, and I really can't think of a time since I was in high school where I haven't been working with students in some capacity. I was a high school speech coach for a while, and then I did some other things. I did a lot of youth group work. But then by the time I was able to do work in the world of psychology, I've worked inpatient in residential facilities. I've worked in hospitals. And then for the last 15, 16 years, I've worked with teens in an outpatient capacity. So just doing therapy, and they're my favorite. I just have always loved that age. And so teens still make up probably 80% of my caseload.
Oh, wow.
And so I am passionate about the world they're in and how we can best connect with them and keep them healthy.
So you see your caseload, that 80% when you're working with teens, it's in an outpatient mental health setting. Is this mostly in person, mostly remote these days? What does that look like?
Well, that's a great question. Interesting. What is it mostly? It's probably half and half, because honestly, I do work with a handful of college students who have kind of gone elsewhere in the state, and we've just continued virtually, which was really the only good thing to come out of COVID, because before COVID, nobody really did virtual therapy. It was this thing that there were questions about. We knew the technology was kind of there, but we were like, yeah, but will it be effective? Will it be the same? Will it be distracting? And then all of a sudden we had to do virtual therapy, and it works. And in fact, we did enough virtual therapy that research could be done. And we found that for most common things that bring someone to therapy, like depression, anxiety, that kind of thing, virtual therapy is just as effective. So yeah, it's probably a mix of half and half of in-person and virtual.
I wonder, this is sort of a little bit of a tangent, but I wonder if that, especially when we're talking about, well, really for anybody, but if we are thinking about the teen population, I wonder if their ability to do it from their bed in cozy pajamas sort of reduces a little bit of an obstacle to actually begin the process. And maybe that would make them more likely to seek in-person therapy someday. I don't know. I'm just sort of bouncing that out there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know I've had some clients, mostly young ones, who found the virtual schooling of COVID almost traumatic. And so they would say to me, I need to meet in person.
Okay.
I don't want to do another face on a screen. Of the students who have opted to meet from home, yes, there are, I'm always there with like some professional background behind me and trying to like look nice. And they're almost always in bed, in their pajamas. I can see like the upper quads of their forehead. That's all they're giving me. And so, yes, I think there is some comfort that they enjoy when they can meet virtually.
Cool. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, okay. So you entered into the psychotherapy world. I know that you said that you've always kind of worked with teens, but did you know when you started your practice or the outpatient part of your career that it would focus on teens, or does that just sort of like how gravity fell?
Yeah, no, I knew I would. I knew in middle school that I wanted to work with students. I didn't know how, but I had enough friends who were like, I had friends with eating disorders and who were feeling suicidal and cutting. And I remember being in 7th or 8th grade and just being like, this doesn't make sense. Like, we're just kids.
Mm-hmm.
We should be enjoying our lives, being able to focus on our friendships, and just like, we shouldn't be this burdened with stuff. And so I made some kind of decision at that point to work with young people when I grew up, to kind of be the adult that I needed or they needed. And I wasn't sure what that would look like. So for a while, I thought I'd be a youth pastor. And then I had a really good English teacher in high school. And I was like, oh, I'll be an English teacher. I'll be an awesome English teacher and change lives through the power of Shakespeare or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I took Psych 101 my second year of college. I had no exposure to psychology before then. And I was just like, oh, this is it. This is the language that I've been looking for. And I changed my major and never looked back. So my idea was always to work with teens. And I had a supervisor early on who I shared that with. This is in grad school. And he was like, well, I mean, you're young, you'll grow out of that. Like, everybody thinks they want to work with teens, but then they try it and it sucks. And so then they don't want to anymore. And he was wrong. I love it. There's such an honest, malleable, fascinating group of people. They're still becoming people. Mm-hmm. And I love the chance to, any changes they make in their teen years are going to put them on a different trajectory for the rest of their lives and benefit them year after year after year. Whereas, if they come to therapy when they're 50 and their marriage is falling apart, we can't go backwards. We can't fix whatever led up to that point. But I love the chance to put them on a different path.
Well, I love that you said that. And it really made me think, like, the things that we thought in our teenage years were permanent are the things that were the least permanent. Like the decisions we made about career and city that we live in and all of that, those things were so fleeting, or could be fleeting if they needed to be fleeting. But you're right. The tools and skills that we learn as teens to actually function in the world and live our best lives from an internal standpoint, like, that's so true, that if we can give kids those strategies earlier, that can really make a difference. So I really love the way you said that. So my kids, I also have 3 kids, and my kids are all teenagers now. And so I know.
And one just turned 18, right?
17. I've got a year left.
Oh, 17.
17.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I got one more year. And
oh my gosh.
I know. And it's funny that you said that you love the teen years so much. And I have a question for you a little bit later about this, but like, I'm finding this to be the candy of parenting, which is so funny, because I think that some people always would say like, oh, just when they're teens, it's so terrible and all that. And I know I've got a ways to go. I've got many years left of it, but it is such like a delightful period of time. And for all the reasons that you just said, they're becoming who they're going to be and all that. But as a mom of 3 teens, and just from my own life, I know that when you're seeking therapy for yourself or for somebody else, it can be, so incredibly overwhelming to know where to go, who to go to, how to even get involved. And so for parents that are seeking a therapist for their teen in general, whether they're just like sorting through the Google search or making decisions, what is your recommendation of how somebody should navigate finding the right therapist for their teen? And the second half of that question is like, what does the way you approach therapy for teens, like, how does that best support them? And kind of, why should someone pick you?
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. So to answer the first part, Therapy is a unique relationship. It is not like picking a pediatrician or a podiatrist. My pediatrician growing up was like consistently ranked like top in the city because that was important to my mother. But this man had no bedside manner. I would go to him. He'd be like, "Hey, Zach, how are you?" And I'd be like, "I'm fine."
Yeah.
And then he would slap me on the arm and be like, "Then why are you at the doctor's office?" And he thought he was hilarious. And he was so abrasive, but he was good at his job. He would give me the right medications. He would diagnose correctly. And so his help helped. But therapy is such a more collaborative process where you need to want to work with your therapist and feel safe with them. And so fit is just so much more important, especially for kids and teens, because they're not going to open up if they don't trust me or like me, that kind of thing. So honestly, one of my favorite things about this generation that is a change that I feel like I've really witnessed since I began doing therapy is that these kids are not afraid to talk about the fact that they're in therapy. I remember early on working with teens and they'd say, "Oh my gosh, do you work with anyone else at my high school? Like, is anyone going to find out that I'm meeting with you?" And now all the time I get clients come in and they're like, "Hey, Zach, I just told two of my friends about you. So if you get a call from like a Jake and a Tim, I just sent them your way because they need therapy." And I was like, I'm in therapy. I got your guy. So I love their willingness to just talk about it. So that would be my first suggestion. If a student is looking for therapy and they feel comfortable, just ask their friends, like, or have they heard of a friend who likes their therapist? That'd be a good place to start. Who's your therapist? Why do you like them? That kind of thing. Kids are really cool with sharing that kind of information now, which I think is great. I know sometimes parents talk to each other about this stuff too, but a way that a lot of people find me and other therapists is on the Psychology Today website. So they have a therapist finder function.
Is that a process that you recommend involving your teen in, or are you imagining that interview process to be more of the parent?
So the thing that's different with working with teens is that they are often resistant to coming to therapy. Sometimes they are asking for it themselves, but sometimes it's their parents saying, "I think you should talk to someone." If they are resistant, they might not want to be a part of the search. And you might just have to do your best to find someone and hope they connect. And one of my favorite things, I love it when a kid and a parent sit down in my office for the first session and I'm on my best behavior, mom's on her best behavior. And I'm just like, "So what brings you in?" And the teen is like, "I think this is bullshit. I don't think I need to be here. I think my mom is the problem," all that kind of stuff. I love that. And I am up for that challenge. But so if that's where the teen is at, they might not be interested in the search. One thing that can maybe help, because I think teens, like most humans, like the experience of being in control. So I think parents could say something like, "Hey, it's really important to me as your parent that you at least try meeting with a therapist. I'm going to ask you to do that. I'd love it if you could be involved in finding the therapist. Could you please meet with these people and or could you please read these 3 profiles and you tell me who you'd like to meet?" And that gives them a measure of agency in the process, which might give them some buy-in.
So this brings up a question that I've been thinking a lot about, and a topic I've been thinking a lot about, and that's sort of this distress tolerance and productive struggle. And I think really, especially since COVID, as a parent or somebody who's working with teens, this has become a exponentially trickier topic to navigate, because there's sort of this balance between, like, life is hard. You've got to learn to deal with it. We have to build up your muscle of dealing with hard things. And that's sort of like this last leg of parenting youth, parenting kids. That's sort of our responsibility, is to teach them to kind of deal with it and manage those hard things. And on the flip side, it's like helicopter parenting or lawnmower parenting or whatever it is, like, let me smooth this over for you to make this not hard. And I do think that COVID threw a whole wrench into that, because it's like, well, now we just all went through something incredibly hard, and we don't want our kids to have to go through harder things than they already need to or already have had to during their childhood. COVID kind of just shook up all of the things that we thought were mandatory for kids. Being in school all day, every day, keeping your religious studies up, doing all of these things that we thought were just mandatory and we just took for default setting. We had to get creative, but now it's like, well, then why are we going back to this structure? Why are we forcing kids to do this sort of thing? So it's a long way of painting the picture to really ask, what are your recommendations for how hard do we push our teens to gut through things themselves, because it builds that distress tolerance or builds that productive struggle muscle? And when is it okay to lessen the burden on them because they have already been through so much?
Oh, that's such a good question. There's so many layers there, Jamie, that we could talk about. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that one of the things that makes this the hardest is, like you said, we all went through this together. So it's not like our kids went through something that we didn't have to go through or that we'd been through before and had helpful insights about. This was everybody's first pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so even I, as a therapist, I had people coming to me being like, what do I do? How do I cope with this? And I'd be like, listen, buddy, this is also my first rodeo. And it was such a weird position to be in as a therapist. But then, like you said, as a parent, to say, how do I support my children through this when I'm also kind of just taking this day by day? Yeah. So that is the complexity of this situation. And then the other added complexity, like you said, is I think there is so much that all of us pre-pandemic, so many rhythms that had never been interrupted, that we had this sense of like, well, that's just what you do. You, like you said, you just go to school. And now so many things that we took as non-negotiables were shown to be negotiable. And so honestly, I think there's a good and a bad to that. The good part of that is, hey, maybe there are some things that we can reevaluate and find better ways to do. Like I was saying before, virtual therapy has been unbelievable. I have a bunch of clients who are in rural Wisconsin where there's no good local therapists. And so the fact that they can log onto their computer and meet with a competent professional has been a godsend for them. They couldn't access that in their community. But it's also been hard because kids need a sense of, like, when you're building a building, you build that shell of scaffolding around where it's going to be to protect it and to help you be there to build it up. And the rhythms and routines and structures of our kids' lives are their scaffolding while they are growing and becoming who they're going to be.
Yeah.
And what COVID did is it showed that, yeah, this scaffolding is just kind of made up. And sometimes we just have to kind of can it and come up with new structures. But then we're going to go back to the old structures when it's over, because why not? And so honestly, what I have noticed is there is kind of another flip that I have observed in my clients. And this isn't directly answering your question. We'll get to answering your question, but this is just fascinating to me. More and more, I meet with kids who look like model students, great grades, involved in lots of stuff. And so the assumption you make is, oh, this kid, like, they're really passionate. They've got a career in mind, like they're driven, whatever. And then I talk to them and they're like, yeah, I mean, school's stupid. I'm never going to use this stuff. It just keeps some parents off my back, or I just like to be busy and like life is meaningless. So this just keeps me busy. And it's like, oh my gosh, like that's so intense. But I think it's all a product of having their life totally disrupted for a couple of years. And not just disrupted, but the isolation was the icing on the cake. Because it'd be one thing to go through a difficult experience, but still be able to get together with friends and process it and share experiences and share tools and things that helped. But on top of all this, they all had to be stuck in their homes and not interacting with their friends. And I think that was extremely difficult. And so I think as I'm listening to myself talk through this, I'm reinforcing something I've known, which is there is no easy answer to how we get out of this, because we're going to be learning about the effects of having lived through COVID as we all live through it and discover them. And so we have to kind of do this as we become aware of it. But to answer your question, I think as parents, we have to ask ourselves the question, when we are tempted to kind of helicopter parent or swoop in and do something, what am I trying to prevent my kid from experiencing? Like, what am I saving them from by doing this? And if the answer is they need an adult to intervene because this is something that only adults can handle, like if there's a coach or a parent or a teacher doing something that they think they shouldn't be doing, or, you know, an adult isn't stepping up and taking responsibility for something, then a parent can get involved. But If we're trying to protect them from a difficult situation or a setback, I don't know if we're serving them. What's coming to mind, I once met with a teenage client and her parents, and I forget the reason why we met, but her dad said something to me that has just stuck with me for like years now. This client struggled with some perfectionism and was expressing some anxiety about becoming an adult and what if things were hard or whatever. And her dad looked at her and he said, "Hey, I love you enough to let you fail." And as he unpacked that, he just kind of said, like, "I trust you and I trust your judgment. I trust that if you have setbacks, you are going to have some ideas about how to handle them. I know that if you have setbacks, it's not going to affect my love for you. And I trust that if you get to a point where you don't have the resources, you know that you can reach out to us. You have other people you can reach out to. I think you'll still be able to get through that failure. And I love you enough to let you do that. So go out there and live boldly. And if you fail, it's going to be okay." Which I thought was so cool.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, older we get, the more our brains really want to learn through experience. And so when we prevent our kids from having negative experiences, what we're really preventing them is from having learning opportunities. And as a parent, you can say to your kid over and over something like, "It's cold outside. Don't forget to bring a jacket. You might want it later."
Yeah.
I know, Mom, stop. But if you actually let them go to school and not have a jacket, they probably won't do it again for a while, because the experience of how cold they were is going to stick with them more than your words as a parent. And that's not because our words aren't right or don't matter. It's just because their brain is not wired to listen to us anymore by the time they're teens.
Right.
So I think if what we're trying to prevent them from experiencing is kind of just a natural learning opportunity, I think we kind of have to let them have it. And I guess the way that we prepare them to do that is just make sure we feel like they've got, I guess it comes down to problem solving skills. Do we trust that our kids can kind of problem solve if they come up against an obstacle? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I think the flip side of that is also and nudge them to trust themselves in it. I do think that this is, all of my parenting during teenagehood years have happened since the start of COVID. And so I haven't been a parent during this stage of parenting except during COVID. And so much of the years that I have spent parenting teenagers has been in a time when we were doing everything we could to increase our comfort because there was so much that was uncomfortable outside. And so now I'm finding that much of the world has resumed to normal, that I'm having to, say to them, like, I know this is uncomfortable for you. Like, I believe they have the skills and I know that they are going to learn some valuable experience from a struggle, but they are looking at me like, but this is uncomfortable. And I think overall my kids are doing amazing. This is not to call out any one of them in particular, but we had a circumstance where, I'll give an example. So I was at a doctor's appointment that was during the school drop-off window of a morning. And that's something I don't normally do, but I had to do it. And so that meant that my driving teenager had to drive my non-driving teenager to school that morning. And normally that's something that I do. And there was some squabble about where the drop-off was going to be or something like that. And it was very upsetting. It was a big kerfuffle and it all smoothed out very quickly. But I started getting these rapid fire phone calls in the middle of my doctor's appointment that something was just urgently wrong because the kid, whatever. It was not an actual problem, but it felt like a big problem to them. And what I was told was it felt like an emergency. And so that's why they were calling me. And I was like, but an emergency is a state, not like a feeling, and so we kind of had to go back through that and we resolved it and it's all totally fine. But it was in those moments I'm like, we have had to create comfort and safety so much over the past few years that now when we want them to be a little uncomfortable, that feels so foreign to them. So I really like the way that you describe the trust piece. And even if they are not asking for that trust, that they'll figure it out, just sort of being confident that we can, communicate that to them. That's a good model.
I think that's a great example. And that brings to mind two really important things for me. One is that I think you're right on that we just really prioritize comfort because we were all self-soothing. We were all in a traumatic experience. And so of course we're going to do things, like you said, to just make that more bearable. And I kept reading articles about adults having to return to the workplace and it's weird and it's hard. But like you said, if you have teenagers or kids and for 2 years they were out of school and separated from their peers, there's no good time at which to do that, where they're not going to lose out on really important developmental tasks of building social skills, that kind of thing. And so when they get a chance to do it again, there's going to be this discomfort. Our brains kind of like to put discomfort and danger in the same experiential category.
Yeah.
And it's really important to sometimes say to our kids, hey, uncomfortable doesn't always mean bad. Sometimes it just means new.
I love that.
And that's a really helpful and important reframe sometimes to say, you're absolutely right. This is a new experience. I was working with a group of incoming college freshmen at some orientation thing. And these were kids that graduated in the middle of COVID. So this was the first thing they were like together for in 2 years. And I've never seen such a group of awkward 18-year-olds in my life. They did not know what to do with each other.
Yeah.
And I was there as like a psychological support. And for the kids who wanted to meet one-on-one, they were just saying things like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. This is a lot of people. And I would just say, hey, it's just new. It's not bad. These people don't wish you harm. Like these are, some future friends are out in that group. Just tell your brain this isn't bad. It's just new. And the second thing I wanted to say to you is one of the most important things we can do as parents through the lifespan, but definitely into the teenage years, is something called, what would I call it? Okay, I'm going to call it mirroring. That actually means something else in a psychological context. But what I mean is the way that our kids get confidence is by borrowing it first.
Ooh.
So nobody wakes up and decides they're good at something. They are first told by someone, hey, you're kind of good at that. And if they hear that enough, they internalize that sense of, oh, this is a strength of mine. So when we see our kids do something that is outside their comfort zone or brave, or they take a small risk, it's so important for us to just like notice that to them and say, hey, I saw that was kind of hard for you, but you did it anyway. That was really cool. And just that's enough. Just let them know that you notice it and reflect it back to them. So 2 important things. One, if they start to hear that consistently or about a certain theme, they'll start to internalize, oh, I'm actually pretty good at this. But the other thing is, it's so easy and tempting as a parent to recognize our kids for their performance or their achievements at things. Hey, you got an A on the test. That's awesome. But if that's all our kids hear, and research backs this up, then when they get a C, it feels like whatever positive rapport they had with their parents now went away because it was contingent on that level of performance. So when we are able to connect with our kids, not just on their performance, but on the level of what their character is, who they are as a person, that's consistent no matter what their performance is. That can go up and down. So if we say to our kids, hey, I know you got a C on that test, but I saw you working really hard. I know you studied. You should feel really proud about how hard you prepared. That's huge. Now they can still feel confident about their ability to try hard, even when it doesn't go great in a moment.
Totally.
So I think those are ways that we can equip our kids as they do hard things, to reflect back to them the strengths we see, the characterological things that we see to be true about them, because then they'll start to internalize those when they hear them often enough.
I love that. And I love how you brought up the newly graduated or early in college age group, because as part of my work, I co-direct a summer day camp and then also an after school program that is largely staffed by this age group that you're talking about and into their early 20s, but sort of those early 20s are still sort of teenagers, especially post-COVID. So I love the frame of it's not dangerous, it's just new, because that is something that I'm seeing, whether these young adults that need to call a parent to communicate about, some wet pants or whatever it is, that it feels very intimidating to them, or, even just the difficulty of maintaining a schedule, a work schedule. It's like having to sort of lay the groundwork of these expectations. And so that's a helpful reframe for me. And then also, as I think about how to talk with them about the things that feel really difficult for them, is that it is uncomfortable because it's new. And I really, really love that. And I love the point about holding up the mirror to them to be like, this is something that I see you as having the skills and the potential, and you're even if you fumble it a little bit, it's still like the effort is there. And so I think that that's really helpful. This brings me to another really juicy topic that I would love to dig into. One of my favorite things that you have said, which is so, so true, is that teens have the most fine-tuned BS detector of anyone on the planet, and that it's so important to approach conversations with that age group in a way that feels authentic to them. And so I'm just wondering if you can explain a little bit about what you mean by that and shed some light on what you see as the best ways to talk to teens about anything, but like especially important topics.
Yes. Oh, I love this topic so much. So in teens development, there's something going on. I mean, the bulk of what they're doing in their teenage years is brain development. And there really is this huge increase in capacity to feel and express nuanced emotions and just understand complex things, navigate their relationships. And, when you're in grade school, you might form friendships based on, we all like the same TV show. Yay. Or we all play football. And then the needs get a bit more deep and complex in high school and college. And I cringe so often when I'm around adults trying to relate to teens, because it's almost like they're trying to play the part of the adult they think the teens want them to be,
right,
instead of just being themselves and instead of being authentic. And so I think that BS detector, I think another way to talk about it would be an inauthenticity detector. And kids just aren't into that. And so there's two things that I would say to parents, and they're opposite. So they're kind of like a yin and a yang approach to kind of working on this. So one thing is, I think we need to be honest with our kids when we just don't get it, because they're growing up in a different world from us. And Jamie, you and I are in a very particularly weird, narrow generation where we were born in a pretty analog world. I just had to do something with my birth certificate, and it was definitely typed on a typewriter.
Yeah.
And yet, by the time we were in middle school or high school, now the internet was there, and we were, burning CDs. So we grew up along with technology. We can remember a time when it didn't exist, but our kids were born into a totally different world from us. They were born into social media. And so we don't know what that's like. We remember being teenagers, but we have no experience being a teenager surrounded by social media, where everything in your life is potential content. We don't know what it's like to grow up in a world where I can have a private conversation with this person and 15 minutes later, the whole school knows. And so we need to have some humility about that. And so if something comes up and we just can't relate, I think we need to be honest about that, but be curious about it. But the yin to that yang is that while we also ask our kids for their input, I think we have to do some education on our own, even the stuff they're not telling us. I think social media is a great example of that we really need to, as parents, educate ourselves on what our kids are out there doing that we are not doing with the internet, because there are some things we might not want to give them access to, that kind of thing. And I think the ways to do that would be just to talk to other parents. I got TikTok purely because I knew most of my clients were on there, and I wanted to know what they were being exposed to, and I wanted to understand their world. So it's kind of a balance. It's okay to say you don't know when you don't know, but I think it also gets cred with my kids. I do the work of every now and then I'll Google, what's the slang right now? What are they talking about? Just so that I can meet them in the middle.
I read this book last year that completely changed my entire mindset on the whole kids and internet and all of that. And it wasn't really even about kids, but the book was called Because Internet. And it was actually a linguistics nerdy book about how the internet has changed the English language, actually changed the function of the language. And I just delighted in this book because I just nerd out about that kind of stuff. But there was a section about why kids are so obsessed with sending each other just pictures of their face on Snapchat, and how the book pointed out that it isn't that kids are necessarily obsessed with their phones. It's that they're obsessed with each other, and that is completely normal, typically developing, healthy connection. And kids have always been obsessed with each other. Teenagers have always been obsessed with
Right.
each other. When you and I were in high school, that looked like all sitting around in someone's basement at the same time, doing nothing, or wandering around
Yep.
Bayshore Mall, doing absolutely nothing for hours on end, or sitting in the parking lot of Taco Bell or whatever it was. And the book pointed out how those places have become so much more inhospitable to groups of loitering kids. Nobody wants the group of kids just sitting in there, whatever. And in some situations, that really has become less safe and less okay for kids to be out in that way. So when kids are just Snapchatting pictures of their face back and forth, it's just part of them wanting to be connected. And so that really shifted my perspective on it. And I will admit, I went back to my kids and I was like, I changed my mind, as long as, and we created boundaries about, at any point, if I'm like, open that Snap in front of me, they have to do that. There's certain rules that agreements we made for it, but it's like, yeah, you're right. Like they don't go and just hang out in someone's basement for hours on end. One, because their enrichment schedules are such that that's not amenable anymore to the way that we live. And two, we would probably be skeptical of that too, So anyway, I think you're totally right that it is a shift. And you and I made it through college without any social media too. We just escaped as it was just beginning, as Facebook was just beginning. And so it is really interesting. And I love the two sides of that like admitting when we don't know, but then also like doing the work to figure it out. I really love that.
That's a really cool perspective. And it is how they get that social need met.
As many of you know, I am a mom and a business owner. And so my life looks like a bit of a juggling act. And I have a feeling yours does too. One thing that has helped me stay organized over the past, I cannot even believe I'm saying this, 13 years, is that I have been using emails to help me coordinate my meal plans for each week. I am someone who does like to cook. I don't mind going to the grocery store or ordering a quick delivery, but making the decisions about what we're going to eat is the mental labor that sometimes is just I'm at my max with. So I have been using emails, EMEALS, for many years. And each week I get a menu emailed to me that is in the category that I want. So I might choose quick and healthy one month, or the next month choose kid friendly. It's really nice. You can switch between your plans. And then each week you get a PDF with all of your menus. The ingredient list is separate. And I go through and I select the ones that I want to make that week. Some weeks I'm making a lot of them. Some weeks I'm only making one or two. The best part is that then I save the recipes and I keep them in a folder and I have them to refer back to on a week where I'm like, oh yeah, what was that I made? Anyway, it just becomes a really wonderful resource for busy families. They have a really slick app. I actually do the printouts, but a lot of people use the app and you can select your meals from the meal plan. You can even order your groceries directly from many main stores. I just personally really recommend emails so much. It's helped me so much over the years. And they are offering our listeners a special discount. If you use the code that's in the show notes to sign up, you will get a gift card from emails just for trying it. So give it a try. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to know which meal plan you make. And maybe we'll be making the same meals on the same days. But I highly recommend it. It has taken away a lot of the mental labor of meal planning for my family. My kids like it because we're not eating the same things all the time. So go in the show notes, click the link, or you can send me a DM on Instagram. I'm at Jamie Gale LLC with the word meals, and I will send you a link to get your gift card for trying emails.
I think what's interesting about that is for most of human history, there would be an identified need, and then we would create a tool that met that need. But starting with kind of the technology of the internet, and since then, we're instead flipping it and going, well, we're just going to create this tool and we're going to see how people use it, which is a cool opportunity, but leaves room for a lot of unintended consequences. So I love hearing kind of how you made that flip and process through that and kind of came to understand that like, okay, my kids are using these tools to connect and like, I can relate to that. I get that they just want to connect with their friends. But again, I think as parents, that's an opportunity for us to model that for them and say, hey, I get why this is important to you. And I want to protect your ability to use this tool as a means to connect with your peers. But I also want to protect you and make sure that's all that's happening. Just like our parents might say, sure, you can go to Taco Bell, but I need you home by this time or whatever it was. Like we need to figure out as parents, what are those new boundaries and limits that we put on this stuff? And yeah, good for you for reading a book like that. Because like I was saying before, so many parents just don't even know what their kids are doing online. And we can't set boundaries if we don't know what they're up to.
Okay, so let's say you're an adult, either in a school or you're a parent or you're an administrator who needs to really have a difficult conversation with a teenager. And we're not just joking about Snapchat or anything like that. And we do have to have a hard conversation. How do we best get that message across to a teenager, but not trample their spirit and their soul along the way? What is the best way to have one of those really hard conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have such a love-hate relationship with technology and the internet because as a creative music, there's so much technology in that other room and I love it and it helps me do so many things. But one of the things that it does with our kids who've grown up with social media is it allows them to curate their interactions and it allows them to not have difficult conversations face to face. You were talking about your work with students working for you and their difficulty calling a parent or whatever. I'll have a kid spend a whole therapy session saying, how do I say this very minorly critical thing to my friend? Because I'm afraid that it's going to destroy our friendship, or I've never had to say something like that to someone's face before. And so that's one of those unintended consequences of living life online where you can think about your text response before you send it. So I think sometimes in those face-to-face conversations, kids can feel pretty flooded. They just don't know. So one thing I would do is I would give them a bit of informed consent and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation about this. It might be kind of hard, but I want to have this conversation because I care about you. When would be a good time? And let them know what's coming, essentially. And they might say, now it's fine. Or they might say, can we do it tomorrow? And I think if it's within your power to honor that, it gives them some sense of agency. And I think that will help them buy into the conversation. The second thing I would say is because of the different ways that their generation interacts with each other, I think we need to be sensitive to our audience. And here's what I mean by that. When teens get a text that's multiple paragraphs, it gives them the ick. They don't like that. That's a lot. But that's how a lot of us adults process. I pride myself in my ability to flesh out my thoughts, but that's not how they talk. And so if we have something important to say, we might need to do the pre-work of going, all right, how can I distill this to just like 3 or 4 sentences? Because that's how my audience communicates. And so to do that, and then to kind of give them some space to respond and be patient with that because they're not as comfortable as we are with these face-to-face conversations. Those are the 2 biggest things that stand out to me. I think not unlike us when we were teens, I think a common defense mechanism with teens is to say to us and say to themselves, whatever, I don't care, that's fine. And just like tell themselves it doesn't matter because that's easier than it really mattering and affecting them. And so to be honest with you, Jamie, sometimes I don't know if the things I would say like the things I would say are the things a therapist would say. So I don't know if it's natural for a parent or someone to say the same thing. But what I would say in those kinds of situations is it's okay if you disagree. It's okay if you've got a big reaction to what I'm saying. I can handle that. And in fact, I'd love to know what you're thinking in response to what I have to say to you. I want this to be a 2-way thing. Because again, I think teens are in this awkward in-between stage where they're definitely not 10. They don't need us to hold their hand in the same ways, but they're not quite adults. And that feels awkward for them too. They desperately want to be seen as competent. They don't want to be talked down to. And yet they do find themselves in situations where they're getting grounded for making some mistake or they're in a principal's office. And I think those are such awkward situations for them because they want to be junior adults and not senior children.
Right. Yeah.
And to give credit where credit is due, my son coined that at one point. I think on his 12th birthday, my son was like, I feel like I'd like you to refer to me as a junior adult from now on.
I love that.
And I was like, how about senior child? Because you're still 12.
Oh, I love that. That's so true.
But yeah, so I think the way that we kind of honor that in between is we say, hey, I want to hear what your response is. I can respect and honor whatever your reaction to this is. If you disagree, I can handle that. Does that answer your question?
Totally. I really love that. And I feel a little called out by the long paragraph thing because, yeah, that's exactly how, from all the training on the 5-paragraph essays to the whatever, we were taught to
Yeah.
distill out our information like that. And when I send a schedule weekly to my team. So we have my after school program has multiple sites. And so I'm sending schedule and any date notes and anything like that out. And when I do send that by email, although we do communicate in an app because I know they're not going to read very many emails, but I have to go back every time and cut it down, cut it down, cut it down. Because the amount of words in these emails, I'm like, they are not going to read one of them. So it is just funny. So, I love what you said. I love the perspective on it. I think that makes complete sense. And yeah, it is different than it was when we were kids, but also the same. And so I appreciate that tie-in.
Yeah. And just one more thing that's the same that I'm sure you can think of someone. When we were kids, the adults that felt like they were demanding our respect, we did not respect.
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that felt like they were willing to not only give us respect, but expect to earn respect in return, we were like, okay, I can work with that.
Right.
Those were the adults that I trusted and that I cared for. So I think that still holds. It's very important to me when I meet with clients that they feel like I honor and respect that they're here to do the hard work of therapy, and there is respect for them. And I don't know, when we feel respected, it just breaks down a lot of walls.
Yeah. My son's basketball coach, I think, does this particularly well. And because he has earned their respect, he can be incredibly hard on them, whether that is for behavior or he can come down on them. Like, I looked in your schedules today and you guys all missed advisory period. That's unacceptable. He can really come down on things. And whether it's for that or something on the basketball court, he does it particularly well because he has earned their trust. He really only says the things that really matter to him. And so I think that is an excellent point and so hard to do, but or at least so hard to do well. So along these lines, you focus a lot of your attention on how parents can do their own work to best support their kids. And so instead of just expecting their kids to do the work, how can parents do their own work to best support their kids? And why is that important?
Yeah. So you said something earlier about your experience parenting that I feel like told me something about your experience as a teen.
Oh boy.
Because whenever we as parents struggle in our parenting, it's usually when our kids are at an age that we struggled at. So if our parents got divorced when we were 5 and we felt like we were falling through the cracks, it'll be really hard to parent a 5-year-old who's having a tantrum or has big needs if we haven't worked through that ourselves. We will just kind of pass on that discomfort because it's almost like we're reliving it through our children. And so that's what I mean, that it's so important for us as parents to do our work. So when you said that you're kind of loving parenting teens, that tells me that something about your teenage experience must have been good enough that you were that there's no trauma coming up for you. That you're just yeah, these are good years. But for so many people, high school was awful. So for parents who were bullied or didn't have good friends or had to move in the middle of high school, it's literally triggering to parent kids through those years. And so that's just because they have unresolved trauma. If they can go talk through that and resolve it themselves, they will have a much easier time parenting. Because what's going on is our kids are coming to us for needs, and we can't give them something that we don't have ourselves. We have to be able to kind of reparent ourselves and be able to comfort ourselves and work through those traumatic memories so that they don't come up when we're parenting our kids.
I really love that because, my reflection of high school is, that I really figured out who I was and what I liked and what I was good at. And so it does feel smoother. And so that's an interesting note to myself to figure out, because I do think that this is not a therapy session for me, but I do think that in my college years, I did start to conform a lot to what was expected of me. And it was less about what I was naturally drawn to and more about what did I need to do to get the outcome that was expected of me. And that's on the horizon, parenting during that stage for me. So that's a good note to myself to figure out what do I need to do so that I can be able to parent my kids through that in a way that would be more aligned with like what my
Yeah.
hopes would be instead of what my experience was. You've given me a lot to think about. We might have to schedule a part 2 on this topic. That's really, really great. All right. I have one more question about social media, and it sort of ties together all of the things that we've talked about. And we don't have to debate the value of social media as a whole because that's a whole separate thing. But one impact of social media that I see both for teens that I work with, my own kids, but also for adults in my life, myself and adults in my life, is that maybe for the first time ever, because of social media, I'm thinking really TikTok specifically, that we can hear stories that we relate to, maybe for the first time, that we see something and we're like, oh, relatable, that's me, or there are mental health providers that are on TikTok sharing information strategies. And so there's this sense a lot of times it's like, oh, I guess I'm not the only person, or like I've never had an original thought ever mindset. And that can be very like nice to see. That can be like, okay, I'm not alone. And maybe somebody shares a tip, like putting your face in a bucket of ice water to regulate, those types of things that maybe we wouldn't know about. This is super complicated because there's obviously so many downsides to misinformation, all of that. But what are your thoughts on this? Is this perhaps like a win of something that's very complicated, or would you just like make it all go away if you could?
So interesting. That's a great question, Jamie. Yeah, it is. So I'm going to be very non-committal. I'm going to be gray. I'm a therapist. Everything's great.
Yeah,
so
okay.
I think the most fascinating thing to me about social media, especially things like TikTok, is that it is just blowing up all the information that traditionally has been gatekept by education, by social status. And I, as a therapist, have learned so much from TikTok. And I used to say to my clients, I would reference a video I had saved and I'd be like, so I recently read in a book and I've just stopped lying. I've just started saying, I just saw this on TikTok and it was really helpful. And what it affirms for me, like you said, there are these universal experiences, and it's so nice to know that. It's also just so cool to me how ingenious and innovative humans are. And how there's just so much information out there and so many things to try. And it's so exciting to have access to that. I wonder what it's going to do to just like these institutions that have been around forever, like higher education and expectations we have for, if I see this kind of professional, they should have this kind of schooling. That's another episode. But so the second part of your question, what are the downsides? So without embroiling myself in controversies, I will say, as a mental health professional, there have been some trends that I've observed on social media like TikTok where things are really gaining traction and they're talking about mental health topics. And me and my wife were like, that's not accurate. Like, that's not true. And we've even seen some professionals on those platforms try to speak into the conversation and say, hey, professional here, I just want to say, like, love the vibe, but this is not consistent with what we know from research and stuff. And then there'll be a backlash against that person because it feels like gatekept information or something like that. So this is new territory. Like I don't know what's going to happen with this. I think, yeah,
it's tough.
It's very tough. I guess here's kind of I don't know how this applies to solving the problem. The thing that we all have in common is that this is all our first time, at least in memory, living on this planet. And so there is still something to be said for experience. So when I have a teenager sit down with me, and this often happens, they'll say, I don't want this. Therapy's weird. Why should I pay you to care about what I have to say? I say, you're not paying me to care. The care is free. The care is why I became a therapist. What you're paying for is the education and the knowledge and the time and the experience that I have put into over years and years to be able to do something with that care and give you very helpful feedback. And so if someone is disseminating information on social media that comes from experience, that's awesome. I guess there are certain things that can only be learned from experience. That's not very eloquent, but do you know what I mean? Like,
I totally do. Yeah.
that's still important. And I don't know.
Well, I see why. I think that your willingness to even wrestle with the question is what makes you such a great therapist for teens. Because I think the default answer for so many adults is like, no, it's bad. You should, all of that. And so I think that your willingness to wrestle with it, your openness to considering what the benefits even are, and recognizing that there are some benefits and that it has a place in 2024, maybe not the place and not one that can replace other experiences. But I do think that that is so important and is in complete alignment with the other things that you said about respecting where kids are and what they're actually experiencing, and admitting when we don't know or when we're new to this, and recognizing that kids today, teens today, are experiencing a world that's just different than in the past. And so I actually think that was, I think the lack of a firm answer was exactly what makes you a great therapist for teens. So I really appreciate that. One last question that I always ask in these interviews is that if you could wave a magic wand on behalf of kids in 2024, what would you wish for them and what messages would you tell them? So you're up for that one now.
Wave a magic wand. I have an answer to that. One of the things that growing up with social media and the internet has done for the kids who've grown up with it is it's given them this expectation that things happen very fast. That things that aren't happening fast aren't meant to happen, or something wrong with it. I don't know. But growing up is hard. And growing up there are many skills that we need to acquire to be successful. You and I are tapping into social skills and those skills of crafting 5-paragraph essays to formulate our thoughts right now.
Yeah.
And I think the immediacy of the internet has given kids a false sense that it's supposed to happen fast. And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with it. And if I could give them anything, I would give them a bit more patience and a bit more grace with themselves, that if they don't have it right away, that's okay. They can just keep working at it, and it'll come with some practice and some experience, and that's actually what the default is. Real life, our personal development, is not as fast as the internet and the world they live in. I have a Shakespeare quote in my office that says, "How poor are they who have not patience? What wound did ever heal but by degrees?" And so I would want them to just, have some grace with themselves, to go slow, to enjoy the journey, enjoy the process. Nothing happens all at once. I would also tell this generation that I am so grateful for them, because there is so much BS that was considered normal before COVID and by our generation that they are willing to question. And it makes me so excited for when they are in power and when they're making the rules, because I think they will be one of the generations to really question things that for years before had been considered unquestionable.
I love that. I'll cheers to that for sure. And I have to also put in, as we're like talking about teenagers so much, when I think back to our teenage years, I mean, we knew each other then, and obviously a lot has happened, but I absolutely just love that we're both doing work in our careers that is so close to the things that we loved in high school. And so I think that's really, really cool. And I just have to put in a little note about that how much I've appreciated talking with you in this way about this topic. And I just really appreciate you being here on this podcast. I would absolutely love to have you back. There are so many more topics that I would love to dive into with you if you're willing. I know our listeners will gain so much from hearing your thoughts and your wisdom and your perspective. So I really appreciate you joining me today. And if you want to share how our listeners can get in touch with you, how can they reach out to you if they want to work with you or have their teens work with you? Like, what's the best way for people to do that?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's been a pleasure, and thank you, Jamie, for having me on. It is so cool to see other people who I grew up with in these helping capacities and just supporting new generations. And you have like your finger in so many things. It's unbelievable how many things that you do. It's awesome. So people can find my practice's website at Neuma Psych. It's spelled NEUMAPSYCH.com. And the way licensing works is I can work with anybody in the state of Wisconsin through virtual therapy or locally, obviously. I can't work with people outside of the state yet, but that's going to be changing later this year, hopefully, for all of us.
Cool.
Therapists.
Well, we will link that in the show notes. Thank you again, Zach, for being here. And to all the listeners, thank you so much for following along. We'll be back next time with another inspiring interview. In It for Youth is a Lit Path Studios production. Music is by Inspiring Audio and Pond 5. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And to learn more about this show and all other shows on the network, visit www.litpathstudios.com.